The Omnipotent Self, a study in self-deception and self-cure. Part 1, The Omnipotent Self. Chapter 6, Fact and Fantasy. In the last chapter, we emphasized the fact that one of the first products of narcissism was the infantile difficulty of distinguishing between fact and fantasy, of realizing the world outside oneself. This tendency to mix up fact with fantasy is by no means only to be found in an abnormal mind. It is present in some degree in all persons. Each one feels himself to be the most real thing present, and in feeling this, he has a tendency to believe that others around him are in some way less real, though fortunately, very few carry it far enough to imagine that all the others are merely part of a dream in which the dreamer is the only real figure. As the Red King in Alice Through the Looking Glass is supposed to have done when the remark is made to Alice, "You're only a sort of thing in his dream. If that there king was to wake, you would go out bang, just like a candle." And yet quite a large number of people find it difficult to realize, firstly, that they must die, and secondly, that the rest of the world will not die also when they die. They know, of course, that this latter is not the case, yet they cannot look upon it as a commonplace fact. Their narcissism refuses to contemplate their own mortality. It represses the fact and leaves the idea vague and unreal to them. In children, the difficulty of distinguishing between fantasy and reality is quite normally much more accentuated than in adults. And since they start in a world of fantasy and their training is to lead them to a world of reality, it is obvious that the halfway stages will be obscured by a strange mixture of the two. All children go through the stage in which fantasy and reality are by no means clearly differentiated, and most young children succeed day by day in fulfilling impossible wishes in fantasies in a manner which a properly developed adult can never do. A little boy desires to possess a pony. If this be impossible, his imagination gives life to a rocking horse, and failing that, he may tie a piece of string to a chair and with a great pleasure and much emotion urge on his fiery untamed steed across mountain and desert. He fulfills his wishes immediately by means of a fantasy, which for the time being successfully replaces reality. If this child grows up normally, this possibility of fantastic fulfillment should gradually disappear. How many adults, for instance, could take a bathtub into their dining room, sit in it, and with the aid of a vivid imagination, thoroughly enjoy a pleasant sail at sea? We trust no one, at any rate of our readers, for they would be of that type which has no perspective, and they would most certainly fail in their vocation as practical men and women. Yet remnants of fantasy thinking remain with everyone, and in a moderate degree, so far as we know. Such remnants do but little harm if they are present in small measure only and kept in watertight compartments. Adult fantasy thinking very largely consists in what is known as identification, which may be either conscious or unconscious. Of this we shall have more to say shortly. At the moment, let us trace out what should happen to the normal child as it grows older. Education and environment should be gradually convincing the child of the unreality of its fantastic thoughts and of its early world, should be inducing it to think in terms of facts and to adjust himself to these facts, instead of attempting the impossible task of adjusting these facts to suit his own fantastic conceptions of them. The method of thought which he should develop in order thus to fit himself to meet the world adequately has been conveniently termed directive thinking. Directive thinking is controlled thought based upon facts seen in their true perspective and with a purpose in view which is both definite and possible. It is the very opposite of fantasy thinking, which is generally indefinite, based upon a lack of perspective and attempts continually to obtain the fulfillment of wishes impossible of fulfillment. In direct thinking, the purpose in view must be purposive to the thinker, a change to be produced in the world, either in its happiness, its morals, its commercial prosperity, or in other forms of progress or even of deterioration, or the purpose may be to effect changes in the individual's own happiness or prosperity. Or it may be directed towards a mental change in the thinker himself, with no immediate idea of changes in his external surroundings. Thus, a man may wish to improve his own character by eradicating a bad habit. He may do this by thinking carefully about it, by analyzing the causes of the habit, by giving himself autosuggestion in opposition to the habit. All this, even if the habit may not in the end be eradicated, must be classed as directive thinking. Directive thinking is thus obviously controlled thinking requiring an effort of attention and concentration as opposed to fantasy thinking which knows but little control save that of desire and little effort or concentration. In all the businesses of everyday life, directive thinking must be employed, whether we are merely using our minds to decide the most trivial problem, such as the best way of eradicating weeds from the garden, or whether we are deciding upon a policy to be pursued in some great commercial or political enterprise. Every time we use our brains in directive thinking, we are establishing a habit which gradually gives us power to produce changes in our environment and in the world in general. Every time we indulge in fantasy thinking, we encourage the habit of living in a world of our own ideas, and we are destroying the habit which enables us to create in reality. The two forms of thinking may, of course, overlap considerably. The novelist or playwright, for instance, is very largely a fantasy thinker. He may feel the emotions of the various fantasy characters which he evolves, but in order to arrange the words and sentences, and furthermore to have an idea to portray, or in drawing attention to evils which he thinks should be remedied, he is using considerable energy in directive thought, so that it becomes obvious that directive thought need not merely apply to the things of the immediate present or even the near future. And in trying to draw a distinction between the two, one is often confronted with a superficial criticism that certain ideas must pertain to fantasy thinking because they can never come to pass. That, however, is quite incorrect. The possibility that an idea may come to fruition in 200 or 300 years' time, and that the thoughts which have been given to the idea must assist its growth and ripening, is sufficient to constitute these thoughts as directive. We must now look at the second important element in the child's early education, which would follow logically upon the first one, that it should be made to face the facts around it, and that is that in its games and occupations it should be encouraged as far as possible to take lines of direct thought and not obtain its pleasures through fantasies only. Thus, it would be much better to give him bricks to play with so that he may use directive thought in designing and building a house, than to give him a ready-made toy, such as an engine wherewith he will merely carry out the fantasy of being a driver or a passenger and of traveling wheresoever he wishes. A toy wheelbarrow which he can take into the garden and fill with real stones and earth is far better than a doll which he will merely imagine to be something to be brought up like himself, which he will endow with fantastic life and feelings which are quite unreal. In fact, as far as possible, the child's games and occupations should involve his doing something rather than merely imagining something. Of course, imagination and fantasy will come into its games and are bound to do so, but as much directive thought as possible should be added. The ordinary fairy tale should be swept from the nursery. Here the child does nothing but identify himself with the hero or heroine in the most impossible of situations of a purely fantastic type. There is plenty of scope for giving a child an interest in stories from the fairyland of science, or from the lives of famous persons in the centuries that have passed, all of which, if properly selected and dressed up, will assist the child's directive thought. For though the facts with which the stories may deal are as wonderful as any of Grimm's fairy tales, they are facts of which the child will never have to be deceived, and he will never have to have his faith shaken in the stories which he has learnt. Thus the child will learn from the outset to think directively. I know that many mothers, when they read this, will be inclined to shake their heads and say to themselves, "Poor little darling, I could never treat it so," and that they will be inclined, as is shown very early in this book, to say, "These things cannot be true," for they are not the ideas they are accustomed to. Yet I can assure them that by means of carrying out many of those actions and teachings which they think are pleasant and harmless, they are really damning the child, while many of these ideas which they might term cruel are really of the greatest value and kindness to it. Moreover, experience has shown that if diplomacy is used, the child will be as equally interested in wonderful facts as in wonderful fantasies. The only difference is that it is more trouble to the parent or educator to search out and deal with facts himself. It is quite true that the child's imagination requires training as part of its intellectual education, but there is vast difference between encouraging it to imagine the possibility of impossible things and encouraging it to exercise its imagination in realization of facts, however far they may be removed from the experience of everyday life. Many people have the idea that a child should be encouraged to use its imagination, whereas in fact the child's imagination requires curbing, training, sublimating. Such people do not realize that the early life of a child is lived almost entirely in imagination, that it has no difficulty whatsoever in using its imagination, and that the real difficulty is in preventing it from using too much imagination directed into false channels and by paths of permanent unreality. End of chapter 6.